The argument about whether or not Donald Trump should be impeached is in some ways a very complex one, and in other ways it's a very simple one. And, you know, for example, there are multiple, news outlets and whatnot, thank you, saying, instead of impeaching him, let's just have a censure resolution. Well, an impeachment investigation, which suddenly turns the House into a courtroom, essentially, and gives the House Judiciary Committee access to things that they wouldn't otherwise have access to, can end up voting to censure rather than to impeach. I mean, it's not an all or nothing, and you don't have to go to the Senate. Excuse me, but... Pardon me, but you do have to start, right? You have to start somewhere. And this is, for example, Thor Hogan in the Washington Post. He's saying censure, not impeachment, is the proper way to deal with the president's misdeed, because it'll pass either house by a simple majority. It doesn't need the 2/3 in the Senate that impeachment does to remove a president from office. Excuse me. And so, there's that. But, frankly, if you look at the history of the Nixon impeachment, it was, the approval of Nixon and his job started to collapse in May of 1973. It was in July, well, it was in August that August 8th that Nixon resigned. So it took about 3 months. And during those 3 months, support for removing him from office went from 19%, which is where it was in May, during the Watergate hearings, all the way up to 57% on the day that he resigned. So the key to the whole thing is not whether you can win in the Senate or the House. It's whether more than 50% of Americans want Trump removed from office. And frankly, I think that the thing that will cause that to happen, the thing that will wake people up to that, is laying out his crimes. I mean, just laying out what this guy has done. I mean, one of the arguments, for example, that his lawyers are making right now, both the House Judiciary Committee, the House Oversight Committee, and I believe, I'm not certain, but anyhow, those two committees, in any case, have subpoenaed Trump's financial records. In one case, his tax returns. In another case, his actual business records, his finance records from his accountant firm, which had said, we'd be glad to give them to you. Just give us a friendly subpoena. Congress did, and now Trump's lawyers are suing, saying, oh, no, you don't. And the argument that they're making is that, yeah, Trump may have committed a crime as a public citizen before he became president. But that's not relevant to what you're looking into. You're looking into whether he committed crimes as president, and therefore you shouldn't have access to his financial records. Do you get how weird this is? I mean, it's beyond weird. It's like a massive dislocation of our priorities. And then you get Rudy Giuliani going on TV over the weekend saying, oh, there's nothing wrong with taking, intelligence from a foreign government and using that in a political campaign. Well, maybe not, but maybe there should be. I think, though, that, the federal law prohibits foreigners from providing anything of value to a campaign in the United States. And I don't know how you could argue, although Bill Barr is arguing this, and the Mueller report was kind of ambiguous about it, how you can argue that stealing Hillary and John Podesta's emails and then releasing them strategically on days when the campaign needed them to be released, how that is not a thing of value. How is that not a thing of value? I mean, if the Koch brothers buy $1 million worth of ads for you, well, frankly, I'd say that's a thing of value, too, and a contribution to the campaign. But, we've got these super PACs and all that kind of stuff. But Rachel Maddow told the story on, I believe it was on Friday, about how, or maybe it was earlier, about how Adlai Stevenson, who ran against, in 1960, who was thinking of running for president, ended up, Adlai Stevenson, well, he was running for president. He was running as a Republican. Russia offered to help him win the White House in 1960 and they held a meeting with him. Excuse me, he was a Democrat. This would have been in the primary. And they held a meeting because John Kennedy ended up being the candidate. They held a meeting with him to offer Moscow's assistance. Stevenson said no. He left the meeting. He went home. He documented every detail he could remember. And then he went to the authorities. 8 years later, the Soviet Union offered the same thing to Hubert Humphrey. And he said no. I mean, you know, we have a history here. But this tipping point, this is a really important thing. You know, I think that I said this several times last week, but I'll repeat it again. When Bill Clinton was impeached, when the House decided to look into the crimes of Bill Clinton, they didn't find any crimes, right? They tried to say that he was involved in a corrupt land deal 35 years earlier. Turned out he was just a victim of it. They tried to say that his wife was a bad lawyer. Turned out she was a great lawyer. They tried to say it was illegal for Hillary Clinton to have fired somebody in the travel office. Turned out it was perfectly fine. It was a normal part of business in the White House. This was just more faux outrage, from the Republicans. And every single one of these things were part of, essentially what became an impeachment inquiry. And then finally they discovered that, he'd had sex with Monica Lewinsky. And it turns out he hadn't actually had what, is generally regarded as sex, that is, intercourse. He did not have that with Monica Lewinsky, which is why Bill Clinton thought he could lie and say, no, I didn't have sex with that woman. Because, they never actually completed the act, as it were. It was just, it was just oral stuff. I don't know how to say this. I'm trying to make this a friendly, a family-friendly show, although most kids are in school right now in any case. But the point is that what we learned had nothing to do with actual crimes. You could argue it's a moral crime, but it wasn't an actual, most of the laws about having affairs have been taken off the books and, had been taken off the books long ago, in the 70s and 80s. It was not against the law. What was against the law that Clinton did was he lied about it. But I don't think the average American, in fact, we know the average American didn't think that that was an impeachable offense. About half of all married people, men and women, have had affairs. Americans look at this and go, really? This is your crime? But if the House starts looking into the crimes of Donald Trump, you've got this exhaustive New York Times examination of, Donald Trump, who said he borrowed $1 million from his dad and had to pay it back. No, it turns out that, every year he was getting $1 million from the time he was born. He was a multimillionaire by the time he was 6 or 7. Donald Trump took over $400 million from his dad, and much of it he took from his dad's estate after he died in ways that were illegal. His sister resigned a lifetime federal appointment on the federal bench to avoid being investigated for this. Trump doesn't want to be investigated for this. The New York Times laid it out. And that's just one of his crimes, his many crimes, his money laundering on behalf of oligarchs all around the world, the emoluments violations, the campaign finance crime. This in and of itself would have taken down any other president if any man had gotten elected, or I suppose a woman too, but it's particular. I think this is specific more or less. If any man was convicted or, had paid over $100,000 to cover up having had a year-long affair with a Playboy bunny and a one-night stand with a porn star and then became president, I think most Americans would say, that in and of itself, if you pay to hide that, that's a campaign finance crime. And there's no doubt about this, by the way. That's what Michael Cohen is going to prison for. And the indictment against Michael Cohen says that he did it because he was directed to do it by individual one, a.k.a. Donald Trump. So I don't think the average Fox News viewer knows this. The challenge that we have is that only about 8 million Americans regularly get their news from cable news, whether it's Fox, probably 2 or 3 million Americans, or whether it's CNN or MSNBC, another 5 or 6 million Americans. That's about it. Then you've got, probably another 10 or 15 million Americans who get a good chunk of their news, or at least their political opinions, from right-wing hate radio. So you've got a total of 20 or 30 million Americans, which, can turn out, that's kind of the primary electorate in the Republican Party. And arguably the Democratic Party as well. The people who are actually paying attention. But most Americans aren't paying attention. Most Americans are, maybe getting their news from a half-hour news show in the evening on the big networks, or even the local news, or they're getting it from reading their newspaper, or they're getting it from Facebook or whatever, but they just really don't know what's going on. They're not well informed. An impeachment hearing that is actually looking into these crimes, where people are testifying, and that testimony is going viral, it's going live, it's out there. An impeachment hearing would educate the American public, which is exactly what happened during the Watergate hearings. We went in a 3-month period. In 1974, we went in a 3-month period from 19% of Americans saying that Nixon should be removed from office to 57% of Americans. Why? Because of the show on TV. Trump is saying, hey, I'd welcome it. I'd love it. Yeah, just like he said he really wanted to talk to Mueller. This is the thing that, in my opinion, actually terrifies the Republicans.